Hello. So thank you for those who joined me, and I apologize for being a few minutes late. This is my first Facebook Live, so I was ironing out a technical issue or two. So welcome to our discussion about fears, phobias, everything that goes bump in the night. It is October 1st, and full disclosure, I am a huge fan of Halloween, the month of October, and I absolutely love talking about phobias, and working with people who have phobias is one of the things that I love to do the most clinically, helping people with phobias. So my name is Dr. Janice Gravani, for those who don't know me, and anxiety, fear, phobias, those are my areas of expertise. This is my first ever Facebook Live, so if you are trying to type in a comment or a question and I don't get to it right away, I will do my best, and just rest assured that it's probably a technical difficulty, and that is about it. So let's get down to the subject at hand, phobias. What are they? Where do they come from? So first ever kind of mention of the word phobia, right, comes from actually the Greek gods. So Ares, who was the Greek god of war, his son, Phobos, evidently was so grotesquely terrifying looking, right? His image was so incredibly scary that the Greek soldiers would actually paint his picture on their shields when they went into battle because he was so scary to scare their opponents. And that's actually where the word phobia comes from. So wasn't really commonly used until the late 1800s. So late 1800s are when we see phobia being used to talk about fear in the way that we use it now. So that's when we really started to hear about fears of different things, and they get all sorts of cool Greek names and all of that fun stuff. So what in the world is a phobia? And what's the difference between a phobia and a fear? So basically, a phobia is an excessive fear, and that's important, right? It's excessive. It is out of proportion from the actual danger that you are in. So if you're having a fear reaction to something that's actually dangerous, like your leg is getting bitten off by a shark, that's not a phobia, right? That's a natural reaction to something really terrifying that's happening in that moment. Right? A phobia is an excessive fear reaction that's out of proportion with the actual danger. And here's the second really important point: that interferes in your ability to live your life, right? So another example might be, I live in the Northeast. Let's say I feel fearful of scorpions. Now, I have never seen a scorpion anywhere in the Northeast. There's nothing I would do to really alter my daily routine so I don't come into contact with scorpions. That's not really going to qualify as a phobia, right? Because it's not interfering at all in my daily life. So you've got to have the excessive fear that's out of proportion, and you've really got to have the interference in daily life. So here's what that might look like in practice. So let's say you have somebody who has a dog phobia. And I see that people are continuing to join, so welcome. We're talking all about phobias. And if you feel like you missed anything, just pop in with questions and I'll do my best to answer them all. So what a phobia would look like in practice: let's say somebody is afraid of dogs. Now, they might be afraid of a dog no matter the degree of threat that the dog presents to them, whether it's a toy poodle or a German shepherd, whether it's growling, whether it's lying down, and they might start to do things, right? Engage in avoidance behaviors so that they don't have to come into contact with dogs. So what they might start doing first is scanning the street every time they turn a corner and making sure that there are no dogs around. And then maybe when they see a dog across the street or coming down the street towards them, they're going to hop on over to the other side of the street. Then maybe they're going to start avoiding going to parks, going to other favorite places because they're so scared that they're going to run into a dog. And then eventually, it might come down to when they aren't able to avoid, really having to suffer with that intense fear if you're not able to escape from the situation. So that's really what a phobia looks like in practice. And you might be familiar with a bunch of different names for phobias. there are kind of three main types that psychologists and mental health professionals tend to talk about. So probably the ones that folks are most familiar with are those situational phobias, right? So we might have, oh, I don't know, fear of death, fear of Halloween decorations, blood injection phobias, very, very common phobia. People are afraid of spiders. Probably the two most common ones going on right now would be fear of heights and fear of spiders. Public speaking also ranks pretty highly up there. So those are what we would call situational phobias, right? You're not feeling the fear response unless you're in that particular in that particular situation. So maybe you just saw my own little public speaking phobia or anxiety come out there. The next one that people talk a lot about is social phobia, or at least it used to be called social phobia. So we now call it social anxiety disorder. Pretty self-explanatory, extreme fear of judgment, embarrassment in social situations. And then the third type of phobia, and this is the one that people most often kind of get wrong and get confused about, is agoraphobia. So if I were to ask most people what they thought agoraphobia meant, I think what they would tell me is a fear of going outside. That's what it tends to be depicted as in the popular literature, like, oh, somebody's agoraphobic, they're afraid of going outside. And that's not true, actually. So what agoraphobia is it's a fear that develops usually in response to a panic attack, where someone develops a fear of not being able to escape a situation where they're likely to have a panic attack. So you can develop agoraphobia really towards anything. So people might have agoraphobia about bridges, airplanes, cars, driving in certain locations, right? So it's not fear of leaving the house per se, it's fear of being stuck in a situation that you won't be able to get out of, that you'll have a panic attack, and then won't be able to manage the consequences, right? So to recap, we've got three different types of phobias: situational, social, agoraphobia. Phobias are extremely common. Lifetime prevalence in the United States, about 11% of the population, which if you kind of take a step back and think about that, that is 25 million people. So I'm just going to say that again, 25 million people. So if you're out there and you're struggling with a phobia and you're thinking that it's strange or weird, or why would in the world, what's the rational explanation for why I would be scared of this thing, you are absolutely not alone. And I think that is such an important point, because oftentimes when I meet with people in treatment for the first time, they'll say that what took them so long to actually meet with a professional was embarrassment, that they couldn't cope with it on their own, that they thought it was this really weird thing that no one else did or no one had ever heard of. So phobias are some of the most common anxiety disorders, really common and very treatable, which I will be talking about in a few moments. Next question that a lot of people ask is where do phobias come from? Right? I have this phobia. Let's say I have this really intense fear of snakes, right? It's only natural that I'm going to start to ask myself, where in the world did this fear come from? And I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist. So typically, cognitive behavioral therapists, which could be its own Facebook Live discussion that I'll do at some other time, we don't spend a ton of time talking about where things came from. What our main focus is on what's keeping things going in the moment. Because the idea here is that, learning what caused your phobia or what its roots are might be absolutely fascinating, right? And we could spend years trying to get to the root of that phobia. But let's say you have a spider phobia and you've had it at least since you were 9 years old. And now you're 30 and you're seeking treatment for the first time. You are a completely different person than you were when you were 9. And it's likely that the things that are keeping that spider phobia going are also completely different. So we focus on the things that are keeping the phobia going. Now, there are many other psychological theories that have fascinating theories about, where phobias come from, but that's just not something from my perspective, from a cognitive behavioral perspective, that is particularly useful when it comes to treating them and reducing the symptoms. The other really fascinating thing that I get when people, ask where did they come from is there are those folks who are able to identify, yep, that was the moment. So you have someone who might say, I was on a cross-country flight and we encountered the worst turbulence I have ever been in. The plane was shaking, the luggage bins were popping open, things were rolling in the aisles, babies were crying, people were praying. Ever since then, I've refused to get on a plane, right? It's pretty clear cut where that person's phobia came from, and they're really able to say, yeah, that's when it happened. There are other people who will come into treatment and say, I can't remember a time that I wasn't afraid of the dark. It's just always been. And they have no explanation, no idea why, can't remember ever having any traumatic experiences in the dark. And that's not uncommon either. Not everyone's able to pinpoint that moment. In fact, I don't know that most people are, at least not most people I've met with. And then you get people who are able to recognize that their phobia gradually developed over time. So maybe they were a little fearful of the dark when they were younger. And then as they grew up and they started sleeping with the lights on and started being concerned about when they weren't able to kind of see all of their surroundings, then they noticed that it just got worse over time. And they're seeking therapy now because it's gotten worse over time. So now that I've disappointed everyone and told you that I can't tell you where your phobia comes from, hopefully we can make up from that by explaining that I can tell you how to treat your phobia and that there is really good treatment out there. So the kind of gold standard best treatment for phobia is something called exposure and response prevention. And this is something that I think a lot of therapists know, but not a lot of therapists actually do in practice. And I can remember back when I was in training, I really, this was years and years and years ago. You can look it up. There was a New York Times article and it was called, I want to say the title was The Cruelest Cure. And the picture that came with the article was somebody shoving someone into the trunk of a car. I overall think the article painted a pretty positive picture of exposure. I'd have to go back and look, but just that title and the picture, I think, were enough to throw some people off from a really, really effective treatment. So like I mentioned a few moments ago, we don't know where phobias come from, but we can tell you what's keeping them going. And this goes into why exposure and response prevention work. So there are two main behaviors that people engage in that tend to keep phobias active. So those behaviors are avoidance behaviors and safety behaviors. So again, we're just going to use a really simple example, somebody who has a phobia of dogs. Avoidance behavior is pretty self-explanatory. Every time I know there's going to be a dog, every time I see a dog, I am going to avoid that dog. I am going to run to the other side of the street. I'm going to avoid parties. I am not going to go anywhere where I think that there might be a dog. Now, how does that keep that phobia or that fear going, right? One, in the short term, let's say your friend invites you over to a party and there's going to be a dog there and your anxiety spikes and you say, you know what, no, I can't make it. I just got, too much going on that night. Your anxiety will immediately go down in the short term, right? There's like a relief. Okay, I avoided that. I don't have to go. But then what happens is you don't get the opportunity to actually go into the situation and learn that your feared consequence would not occur, and learn that if some degree of your feared consequence did occur, that you would likely be able to cope with it much, much better than you're giving yourself credit for. So now the next time you encounter a dog, you're going to be even more anxious than the last time because you missed all of those learning opportunities. And the same thing is going to happen, right? Your anxiety's going to spike. You're going to avoid the situation. It's going to go down. And then you're going to start to believe that the avoidance is actually the thing that's keeping you safe. So then you'll avoid more and more, right? And it becomes this self-perpetuating cycle. Second type of behavior, and these are the type of behaviors that are a little bit more insidious. They kind of fly under the radar, those safety behaviors. So let's say you get invited to some sort of party with a dog and you absolutely can't avoid it. It's the career advancing opportunity of a lifetime, and you just have to be there. You can't avoid it. And your anxiety is through the roof. You're incredibly fearful. So what you might do instead to compensate is start engaging in safety behaviors. So somebody with a dog phobia, let's say, for example, might put pepper spray in their pocket. They might constantly scan the room for any signs of the dog. They might ask their party companion for constant reassurance. Hey, did you see the dog? You know, does the dog look angry? Does it look okay? Right? All of those things are safety behaviors. And when you look at some of them, you might think to yourself, well, Jana, is there anything really that wrong with asking someone a few times, you know, hey, is the dog there? Do you think the dog looks angry? You know, it seems like a pretty benign behavior. Who's it really hurting? And the answer is actually it's hurting you. So in the same way that avoidance behaviors keep your anxiety going over time, it's the same thing with these safety behaviors. So every time you ask that person next to you for reassurance, or you pat your pocket with the pepper spray in it, you are giving yourself the message that those things are the only things keeping you safe. That there is nothing, you know, that there is actually something inherently dangerous about these situations, and the safety behaviors are the only things keeping you safe. So then the next time you're in that situation, if you can't avoid it, you're going to need more safety behaviors, and you're still going to feel just as anxious, because you're never going to give yourself the opportunity to see that the safety behaviors aren't actually the things that are keeping you safe, right? That there was nothing that inherently dangerous about the situation to begin with. And here is where treatment comes in. So first thing that happens if someone comes into my office and they say, you know, hey, I have a phobia, is I do a thorough assessment. So I don't just focus on their phobia, I focus on everything, right? I want to know about their development. I want to know about history of mood disorders like depression and bipolar disorder. And I want to know about other anxiety disorders. And of course, I want to know about their phobia. So once it's clear that that's what someone is dealing with, and that it's not, you know, as a result of something else, or it's not like I mentioned earlier, where it's actually like a justified fear, where there's something really, really scary to be fearful of, that maybe we need to work on whatever's going on there. You know, once there's certainty that what we're dealing with is a phobia, the treatment of choice is something called exposure and response prevention. So what you do in exposure and response prevention, part one is a little similar to what we've done now, right? A lot of education about why this treatment is helpful and what keeps anxiety going, because knowledge is power, right? Most people have some sense that what they're doing isn't helpful, but there's still this idea that, you know, if I could just avoid every single situation, if I just never had to get on a plane again, if I could just never see a dog again, everything would be fine. So sometimes that education that, you know what, those avoidance behaviors really aren't helping is a very, very helpful thing. And it also gives a rationale for the treatment. So the treatment, exposure and response prevention, is kind of exactly what it sounds like, right? So you work to expose somebody to the thing that they're afraid of. And the response prevention part is preventing the safety behaviors. And it's very important that those two pieces of treatment go together, by the way, because I think sometimes when I see a lot of folks in my office, they'll come maybe after several what they might consider failed attempts at exposure and response prevention. And what I've often found is they only got the exposure piece. They didn't get the response prevention piece. So that's very important. So what we do in exposure and response prevention is first we have somebody start keeping track, you know, of all the different situations they're avoiding and all the different safety behaviors that they're engaging in. And once we have a really, really clear picture of what that looks like, we build what's called an exposure hierarchy, which is basically a very fancy way of saying we build a big list. So let's say, using dogs again as an example, that somebody is coming in for treatment of phobia of dogs. You know, maybe way down on the bottom of their list, right? You start with the things that evoke the least amount of fear. Might be just looking at a picture of a dog or watching a video of a dog. All the way on the top of that list might be standing in the middle of a dog park, you know, giving out treats to dogs of all sizes, shapes, and temperaments. And then there's going to be a load of stuff in between, right? It might be listening to barking dogs, watching videos of dogs, walking a very, very calm dog, holding a very, very tiny dog, right? All of those things in between. And then there's the response prevention piece. So once you start exposure therapy, so let's say we're starting just by looking at a picture of the dog, right? We all agree that we're not going to be doing the safety behaviors. So whatever safety behaviors, whether it's asking someone over and over again if something's okay, which our fancy word for that is seeking reassurance or reassurance seeking, or whether it's, you know, looking away or distancing themselves, whatever it is, we're going to be working to not engage in the response as they slowly move up on their hierarchy and start doing things that are more and more challenging. The idea here is that often what people experience is a sudden, it looks something like a hill, right? There's a sudden spike in anxiety, really, really scared, and then eventually the anxiety actually goes down naturally. So people learn a couple of different things. So first thing is that their feared consequence isn't happening, right? They're not getting mauled by a dog. Second thing that they're learning is that their anxiety will actually go down on its own without them doing a thing. So without them avoiding a situation, without them engaging in a safety behavior, the anxiety will just go down on its own. And then as we have those repeated experiences, we go up on the hierarchy. And there are a couple of very important rules to follow when you're doing exposure therapy. So one, you know, is really we go at people's own pace. So I think what has happened over the years is that there are all these treatment manuals, and they're great treatment manuals, by the way, not throwing treatment manuals under the bus, that have come up that seem to give people the impression that phobias and fears should take about 12 sessions to treat, which can absolutely happen. If you have just a standard treatment, everything goes as planned, someone's really motivated, and they kind of go lockstep through the process, you can treat a simple phobia in 12 sessions. However, I'm also concerned with someone actually wanting to remain in treatment. So if that means that we have to go a little bit slower and go at someone's own pace, and they're saying, you know, I'm not ready to move up this week, but next week we're going to, that's okay too. You know, we're not in a research study, so we don't have to proceed lockstep in that way. So we go at your own pace. There are no surprises. So I would never, and this is something that I discuss with people at the outset of treatment, you know, it's not like somebody would walk into my office and I'm gonna throw a spider at them. So we agree on everything ahead of time, and they're free to say no. You know, there's no forcing. Consent is a very, very important part of the treatment process, and especially with a treatment like exposure and response prevention, it's important that it's ongoing and that the person recognizes that, you know what, at any time you can say, this is a little bit too much for me. I need to back out of this. And what my line, my party line, what I always tell people is I will cheerlead, I will cajole, I will encourage, I will motivate, but I will never force, right? I don't think that's helpful. And usually what happens is people end up taking a step or two back, and then they're ready to move forward, right? Feeling in control, I think, is an important part of it. So that is pretty much all that I was coming here to say about phobias. If anybody has any questions that, you know, they wanted to ask, I can just kind of babble for a couple of minutes to allow anyone to think of questions. Maybe we'll keep going for another couple minutes just in case anyone comes up with something. But otherwise, you know, my advice to you during this Halloween season is that, you know, October is probably an absolutely fantastic time to take stock of those things that maybe do cause you a little fear, and to ask yourself, hey, you know, is that fear? Is that a phobia? And also to remind yourself that fear is not a bad thing. So fear is a completely normal human emotion, and it serves a function. And that function is to keep us safe. And the only time that fear becomes, right, a problem is when it escalates to a phobia and starts interfering in your life. So it doesn't look like anyone has any questions. Of course, you're always free to message me and I'll answer anything that I am able to. And I really thank you all for joining me. This was a lot of fun to talk about. And hopefully we'll get the chance to do some more. And this video will be available evidently forever on my Facebook page. So thank you for watching.